From the 8th to the 11th century, Europe was under siege from ferocious raiders who pillaged towns, monasteries, and even royal palaces. These men lived by the sword and died with it in their hands. But who were these warriors that struck fear into the hearts of kings? What was the real reason behind their conquests, and how did they manage to hold off armies sent after them? The first thing you should know about Vikings is that they weren't called Vikings at all. The term Viking comes from Old Norse and literally means one who goes on a raid. Back then, the people we call Vikings referred to themselves as Norsemen or Danes, depending on where they were from. You see, modern scholars have created the term Viking Age to describe the period of time when Scandinavian people went on these famous raids. This lasted from around the 8th century to the 11th century, and during this time, groups of Norsemen would set sail and pillage anything in sight. You might be thinking that their goal was simply plunder and gold. After all, there's no way that anyone could actually take on an entire village or city, right? Well, not so fast, because while some Vikings did just go for the gold, others had other reasons for sailing the seas. For instance, most Vikings were farmers, fishermen, or traders. However, when the weather was bad or the ice made it impossible to trade during the winter months, many of them turned to raiding. In fact, it was actually encouraged, since if you got captured in a raid, you could get ransomed off for a pretty penny. So it wasn't exactly the best job around, but it paid really well. Another reason why many Vikings went on raids was because of overpopulation. As time went on, more and more people started to live in Scandinavia, and it was getting harder and harder to feed everyone. So many of them decided to leave their home and become raiders instead. To make things worse, there were also political reasons why Vikings went on raids. You see, back then, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden weren't countries yet. Instead, they were divided into small kingdoms that were always fighting each other. And what better way to prove yourself than to raid someone else's kingdom? In fact, some of the biggest Viking heroes were famous for their raids, such as Ivar the Boneless, who led his army through England and pillaged the Northumbrian kingdom. Or Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking warrior who led raids all across Europe. And even though many of these stories are probably exaggerated, there's no denying that these men went down in history. But don't think for a second that being a Viking was all fun and games, because it was actually very dangerous. The thing is, even though Vikings were great at raiding, they weren't so great at staying alive. Just listen to this. When Ragnar Lothbrok went on his first big raid, he and his fleet were caught in a storm, and only 12 ships made it out alive. That's right, he lost 80% of his fleet and crew members in just one go. To make things worse, many Vikings died because of the elements, starvation, and diseases like the plague. Plus, when the Viking Age ended, many Vikings were actually killed by the very people they used to raid. Yep, you heard that right. Because as time went on, the kings of Europe got tired of being pillaged on and started fighting back. So now you're probably wondering, how did Vikings actually manage to raid places without being stopped? Well, to answer that question, let's take a look at one of the most famous Viking raids in history, the attack on Lindisfarne. On June 8, 664 A.D., a group of Northumbrian monks were celebrating the feast of St. John the Baptist when suddenly their prayers were interrupted by the sound of battle. Looking outside, they saw the shores of their island occupied by fierce-looking men who were armed with swords and shields. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, it became clear that this was no ordinary group of men. They were Vikings, and they had come to pillage the monastery. It didn't take long for the Vikings to land on the island and start attacking the monastery. And despite the brave efforts of the monks, they were quickly overwhelmed. As they ran for cover, their attackers looted the church, stole their valuables, and even set fire to their buildings. It was a devastating attack that left the monks with nothing but their lives. But the worst part was that this wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, it was just the beginning of the Viking onslaught. Over the next few decades, the Vikings would go on to sack dozens of monasteries and churches, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. To understand how Vikings managed to do this, let's take a closer look at the attack on Lindisfarne. First, let's talk about the Vikings themselves. They were a ruthless and highly skilled group of warriors who had a reputation for their ferocity and efficiency in battle. They were also well equipped with weapons, like the Dane axe, a large axe with a single edge that was perfect for close combat. Plus, they had other weapons like swords and shields, which made them a formidable force to be reckoned with. But perhaps their greatest advantage was their longships. These were specially designed boats that were perfect for both attacking and defending. They were fast and maneuverable, making them ideal for surprise attacks and getaways. Plus, they had shallow drafts, so they could navigate rivers and enter coastal areas undetected. This gave the Vikings a huge advantage over their enemies, who often had no idea they were coming until it was too late. And that brings us to the next factor that allowed the Vikings to succeed in their raids: their knowledge of the coastlines. You see, the Vikings knew the coastline of Britain and Ireland better than anyone else. This allowed them to plan their raids carefully, choosing targets that were well stocked and easy to plunder. They also knew the best routes to take and the best times to strike, which made it almost impossible for their enemies to defend themselves. Finally, let's not forget about the element of surprise. The Vikings were masters of stealth and deception, which allowed them to catch their enemies off guard. They would often strike at night or in bad weather, making it difficult for their enemies to see or defend themselves. They were also known for using disguises and false flags to trick their opponents, which made it even harder to predict their moves. Overall, the combination of their skills, knowledge, and tactics made it almost impossible for the Vikings' enemies to stop them. One monk who witnessed the attack on Lindisfarne later wrote, "We were all in great peril and did not know what would become of us. Some were slain, some taken captive and carried into slavery, some had their heads shaved and tonsured and compelled to become monks against their will." In the end, the Vikings had achieved what they had set out to do, plundering the monastery and carrying off as much treasure as they could carry. It was a devastating blow for the monks of Lindisfarne, but it was just one of many that the Vikings would inflict on monasteries and churches throughout Europe. For decades, the Vikings continued their onslaught, taking advantage of the political and social divisions in Europe to strike at targets of opportunity. They were particularly fond of attacking monasteries because they were usually well stocked with food and valuables, making them easy targets. But eventually, as the Viking Age drew to a close, the tide began to turn. European kings began to unite and form alliances in order to defend against the Viking attacks. And by the 11th century, the era of the Viking raiders was over. And finally, let's not forget the role that Christianity played in ending the Viking Age. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, it brought with it a new culture and set of values that rejected violence and bloodshed. Many Vikings were converted to Christianity, either willingly or by force, and this led to a decline in the number of raids and attacks. Of course, this process was gradual, and there were still plenty of Vikings who continued to raid and pillage long after Christianity had taken root in Scandinavia. But overall, the rise of Christianity did have an impact on Viking culture and behavior. So what can we learn from the Vikings? Their story is a reminder that even the most brutal and feared warriors can be brought to heel by the forces of faith and change. It also shows us the importance of understanding our history and the cultures of other people. If we can learn from the mistakes of the past, we may be able to create a better future for ourselves. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, goodbye.